Amy did, but she's not going to tell us. Did you? And some shopping. So, I don't know. I really didn't hear all that well. So, speaking of not hearing very well, I know that I was harping about it a lot yesterday, and I'm going to do it again today. When you speak into the microphones, you must speak directly into them. I wasn't picking on Narinder, even though he may felt like it. It's just those AC units are very loud. And if you do not speak directly into it, I can't hear you. I was picking on everybody. Thank you for the correction. I love that. So you must point it directly at you. If you need to bend it down. They will travel. If your head travels, it needs to travel with you. Speaking off to the side will not accomplish the task. You must speak directly into it for all of us to hear you. If I can't hear you, I will call you out on it today. Does everybody understand how important that is? The people around the table cannot hear you from one side to the other if you do not speak directly into the microphone. Because if I can't hear you standing here, I know they can't hear you over there. All right? It is extremely important today. Another thing, yesterday afternoon when we got started, I asked everybody to write down why you're here. What makes you want to volunteer on the board? What keeps you going? Does anybody want to share that this morning to get us started? Narinder, please.
Narendra Malik Cab. Learning more about SRS. After working about 24 years there, I still think I know maybe about 0.5% of SRS, and I'm still learning.
That's awesome, Narinder. Thank you. Does anybody else want to share? I'm not going to make you. I promised I wouldn't. So I'm not going to call anybody out. No? Eleanor.
Eleanor Hobson, Cab. Can you hear me?
Say it again for us.
Eleanor Hobson, Cab.
Now I got you.
Okay. I'm volunteering for the Cab. I have volunteered for the Cab for 5 years plus. As a citizen, I care about our future environment and SRS waste management.
Thank you. And what a great segue that is, because today we're going to be talking about the liquid waste system and the waste management program here quite a bit. We introduced this to you yesterday. This is the diagram that every presenter is going to be using. If I recall correctly, it's on every presentation in today's slide decks. Keep this handy, keep it out. If the presenters talking to you today don't show you where on this diagram they are, feel free to ask them, all right? They will reference this and point you in the direction that you need to go. By the end of the day, I'm hoping that we're all going to understand this just a little bit better. We're going to start off that with a liquid waste operations update with Mark Schmitz. Mark, are you ready to kick it off this morning?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Sounds like the sound check works, but don't raise your head up. Okay, got it? Good morning. Narinder, I have worked 30 some plus years at the Savannah River site, and I know a little bit about a lot of things. This is my first tour through the liquid waste program. I started back in the early 1980s, worked several different places. Much of my early career was in the tritium facilities. I was a tritium facility manager. Then I got a chance to manage H Canyon, HB line, and F Canyon, FB line. I've had a shot at K area and L area. I was a site RADCON manager for a period of time and the site ES&H manager for a period of time. I went off with my parent company, which is AECOM, and did some commercial work, and then came back, Los Alamos in between there, went to Los Alamos for a while, and then came back here to run the Recovery Act work for the liquid waste program. So that was my first opportunity being in that program. And then subsequent to that, I became the Chief Operating Officer and Deputy Project Manager. So that's a little bit about my background. I'm going to talk to you today about the liquid waste program and what we've done recently, what we're doing to prepare for SWPF, which it's all about SWPF and getting ready for that. And then on each one of my slides in my facilities, I'm going to point out one innovation that's happened, one big innovation that's happened at each one of those facilities during our tenure of running the liquid waste program. So a little bit about the company, SRR. We are responsible for the safe storage of all of the high-level waste and the eventual disposition of it. Our contract began on July 1st of 2009, so it's been a 10-year contract now. It originally was a 6-year base contract plus a 2-year option. There have been several extensions to that, and as Mike mentioned in his opening comments, our contract has been extended through September 30th of 2020, when the plan is for a new liquid waste contractor to take over. The current workforce is over 2,500 people. That is the largest workforce that we've had in the 10 years that we've been in place. It's even higher than the staffing that we had during the ARRA days, where we had a large influx of money. A lot of that additional staffing is we are adding people to have a full training shift available to get ready for SWPF operations, because all of our facilities have to give feed to SWPF or take materials from SWPF. So there's a lot of training going into our programs. We're hiring because there is a big turnover of older people like me, because we hired the first generation in the mid-50s, mid to early 50s. They retired in the early 80s, so we hired a big group of people in the 80s, and that group of people that we hired in the 80s are now leaving. And so we're replacing a lot of those with new engineers. The other part of that big staffing is the construction workforce. We're up to about 515 craft employees now, union laborers that do all the hard work of installing pipe and installing equipment. That's higher than it was in the ARRA days. We have gone up 95 people just in the last year in construction to support all of the construction tie-ins we're doing for the SWPF project. An interesting fact I heard the other day from my construction people, to go up those 95 people, they had to hire 360 people. That's how big the turnover is in the construction workforce. Part of that is just the churn that you have in the construction force. The other part of it is the job market in the greater Augusta-Aiken area is pretty good for them. They can get work out of Fort Gordon, they can get work at Vogel, so they're moving around and taking the best job for them. Wouldn't be right unless I said a few things about safety. We're very proud of our safety record. We had a string up through December of last year. We went over 11 million hours without a lost workday case. Then we had an individual, a great mechanic, a very big guy. I mean, he stands like this compared to me. Turned around, slipped, fell, tried to catch himself with his arms, ended up badly hurting his arms. Had to have casts, shoulder damage, wrist, arm damage, that type of thing. So he was out for several months. He luckily is back and is doing very well. Since that injury, we've gone over 4 million, almost 5 million safe hours without a lost workday case. We have been honored by the department to receive their VPP Star of Excellence each year. That's their highest honor. That's their equivalent of the OSHA VPP program. You have to demonstrate the people and processes and procedures for having a safe program, and that gives you star status. And throughout the entire 10 years of our contract, we've had no notices of violation. This is your placemat. So I don't want to make James a liar. It's in my presentation. So this really is, this is our mission. And our mission is really these waste tanks, the management and oversight and the safety of those. We store 35 million gallons of high-level waste. That's a product of fuel dissolution from the canyons that was done during the Cold War. Our goal is to take all or almost all of the radioactivity from those 35 million gallons of waste, high-level waste that we store, and try to get it in glass. The most safe waste form that we have. It's not a perfect process, so some of it will stay in the tanks and be closed with the tanks, and some of it is kept with the liquid form and will be disposed of as a grout in the saltstone facility. But that's basically our mission, is safely storing it, removing the radionuclides, and putting it into glass. So 51 tanks were built in the history of the site, starting with the first tank being put into service in 1954. 8 of those tanks have been taken out of service and formally closed. 6 of those were grouted and closed under the current contract that we have. So that leaves 43 tanks that are operational and for use in the facilities for the processing. And I've got some slides at the end. I want to talk a little bit more about that and what that does to our overall philosophy for operating the high-level waste program. The DWPF has been in process since 1996. It started out on what we call a sludge-only feed. That is all of the insoluble materials that came out of the canyon. It's you've heard of it described as a very peanut buttery kind of material. You pump that up, mix that up, pump it up, and put it into glass, and then that's what we processed up until MCU started up. MCU was our first salt processing. That takes all of, which is most of the volume, the liquid portion of it, and runs that through 2 different processes. One is we put something in it called monosodium titanate, which gloms onto the strontium, and also gets some of the actinides that are in the solution too. We filter that material, and all the solids keep the radioactivity, and that's transferred to DWPF. The second part of the process is what we call modular caustic side solvent extraction, or MCU. That's a liquid-liquid extraction process that uses a couple of chemicals that I'll talk about here in a little bit to actually grab hold of the cesium, remove it from the radioactive material, and that concentrated solution goes on to DWPF for placement in glass. That process was just shut down this past year. It's all in preparation, getting ready for SWPF, because all the lines that we use for MCU and ARP have to now be attached to the salt waste processing facility. So that's our big focus right now, is getting ready for SWPF. So SWPF has exactly the same function as ARP MCU, except it's really supersized. Whereas this facility produced anywhere from 700,000 to 1.3 million gallons of decontaminated salt solution every year. You can expect SWPF to do 7, 8, 9 million a year once it gets up to full operation. As an alternative to both of the liquid extraction processes, both MCU, ARP, and SWPF, we just this year started up a test bed using an ion exchange resin called CST, or crystalline silicon titanate. We have way too many acronyms. That the ion exchange resin grabs hold of the cesium and removes it much in the way that the liquid-liquid extraction process does. We're putting it on that resin and getting a decontaminated salt solution, which also goes on to the saltstone facility. For the time being, our plan is to store that resin on site. Eventually, it will have one of 2 paths, probably. The resin will be sluiced up and put into the DWPF glass, or if possible, if it would be considered a low-level waste, it could be shipped off-site to a low-level waste repository. That's a potential. Okay. So some might ask, why are you doing ticker? Being an ops guy, it is always best to not put all your eggs in one basket. It's good to have multiple options for being able to process material, particularly in the radioactive waste business. There have been 4,200 canisters produced to date. The projection to finish the program is just about 8,200, so we're basically halfway through the operational life of DWPF, if you will. Let's see, did I do that? The glass canisters are stored in the glass waste storage building. I'll talk more about that. The decontaminated salt solution goes to our saltstone disposal facility. We've processed over 17 million gallons of salt that's put into a grout form. That 17 million gallons of salt solution becomes about 31 million gallons of solid grout. So the first facility I'll give you an overview on is DWPF. As I mentioned, it's produced 4,200 canisters, about 1,460 under this particular contract, and it's poured over 6 million gallons of vitrified waste. During this contract, we have had a year of about 330 canisters of glass poured. So that is the production capability of DWPF. That was mostly a sludge-only feed. Mike mentioned that we have only processed 35 canisters this year. There are big reasons for that. Most of the year has been an outage year, getting ready for SWPF tie-ins. And we are also in a phase where, since we've processed so much sludge, we want to match the remaining sludge with the remaining salt feed that we have. So we want to do that side by side with the same amounts of material so that we maintain the glass formulation that we have and the glass quality we have. If the salt gets too far out of kilter with the amount of sludge we have, then we would probably have to do a slightly different glass frit formulation. So that's the reason for slowing down, is to make sure we have enough sludge to match up with the salt feed that we've got. The biggest innovation over the last 10 years was the installation of the melter bubblers, and that's what got us to 330 canisters a year. And it's a very simple idea. You take argon and you bubble it down into the glass pool, and that gives you much better mixing in the melter and much better melt rate, which gives you a much better pour rate and gets you canisters faster. And that was very simply done, and it was a very inexpensive addition to the melter. And we change those out on a regular frequency to keep them viable. There are multiple projects that we're doing in order to get ready for SWPF. I'll cover those real briefly. You probably, I think in our agenda, we've got a couple of presentations that will talk a little bit more about that. But we have the DWPF modifications project. When you bring all that really concentrated cesium and strontium stream into DWPF, you have to be able to handle that. And anytime you bring a radioactive stream, radiation causes water to decompose. It's a very slow process, but it causes water to decompose. And you get hydrogen, and you get oxygen. The hydrogen has to be removed so that you don't have a flammable gas in your process. So you always have to have an air purge going. So to handle this higher cesium concentration and strontium concentration, we have to increase the air purges we have through our vessels in DWPF. So that project did that in preparation for SWPF. We also put in brand new sample systems in our labs for DWPF. So the original designs were there from basically the DWPF was designed in the 80s. So it's a 30-year-old, almost a 40-year-old design. So we upgraded all the samplers that we have in DWPF because the lab will get the most concentrated samples as part of their analysis. And so we need to have ways to make sure we protect and shield those folks from the high radiation that will be seen from those samples. And then the final thing we have is we're doing a lab waste handling project within the lab the waste that they handle. We're going to turn that, and instead of doing it all with glove boxes, we'll be turning that into an automatic process that'll put it in a waste container and have it automatically shipped out rather than people actually having to handle that material. Double stack is an innovation within itself. Here's the DWPF. Here's glass waste storage building number 1. Here's glass waste storage building number 2. In the original DWPF design, there were actually spaces designed for as many as 3 more buildings out here. So they designed it for up to well over 10,000 potential canisters. We came up with a way to take the current design, which has 1 can in each slot, and there are about 2,500 spaces in each of the buildings, and actually put 1 can on top of the other can. And there's just enough room to be able to do that and get the right amount of shielding on the top of it. So it's a very simple thing that we did, and we basically doubled the storage space in this building. And what that did is, rather than having to build a new $130 to $150 million facility, we're able to save about half that cost and turn it in, use that money to redesign each one of these and make it so each one of these holes can take 2 cans. So we've saved over $75 million in taxpayer money with just that idea. We're further looking at whether we can double stack in glass waste storage building number 2. However, it is a slightly different design. When they built it, they tried to reduce cost just a little bit, which was a good idea at the time, but the building's about 8 inches shorter in height, which when you go to double stack it, it makes it very, very close. So we're looking at innovative things like maybe having a uranium depleted shield plug that would go over the second canister, and then you wouldn't need a very big plug to shield it from the radiation. But we're working on that. We think we can do it, but there's still some work to be done there. ARP MCU, again, has piloted everything that SWPF will do. All the processes that are in SWPF were done in ARP MCU. So everything in SWPF should work very well. It's not like it's starting up a first-of-a-kind facility in the Department of Energy complex. It processed over 7.4 million gallons over its life. It was designed and built with the idea it would be a pilot facility operating for about 2 to 3 years. So we put 2 major life extensions into it to get the current operating life that we got out of it, 10 to 11 years. To have gone any farther, we would have had to have another major shutdown and life extension to get another couple of years out of it. So we thought at this time with SWPF so close, it's best to go ahead and shut it down, save the dose to the individual workers that would have had to go on and do that work to refurbish it, bring it down, and declare success. So it has been a very successful campaign for ARP-MCU. The biggest innovation for ARP-MCU was changing the solvent to what was called the next generation solvent. We have a molecule, and I like to describe it as, I'm a chemical engineer by background, but me it's kind of, if you look at its physical shape, it looks like a baseball mitt. Okay, and the cesium ion, it actually catches it in the mitt, and then you extract it later out and put it in DWPF glass. So it catches it like that. And so this calyx molecule, as it's called, there's a new and improved version. We had what we called Bob calyx, and they went to something called Max calyx. So instead of having DFs, decontamination factors, the amount of cesium you remove versus what's left behind of 150 to 200. We improved the decontamination factor to over 60,000 with this new extraction process. So that's over 4 nines removal of cesium from the radioactive waste. So very good innovation. And then we have officially placed ARP MCU in operational standby. It is still available for operation. However, all the lines have been disconnected and now connected up to SWPF. So if there was something to go seriously wrong with SWPF, then we could reverse all that process and hook it back up. But it would be quite an effort to get it back to that point. This just gives you a history on SWPF. I know this is probably real hard to see from the back of the room. But it was originally the technology was designated in February 2004. In just over 4 years, the process started hot operations, which is outstanding for the DOE complex. It processed in total, as I said, 7.4 million gallons. And I think Mike mentioned in his opening comments that we celebrated 10 years in contract, and we also celebrated the successful operation of MCU, and Ike White, the EM advisor, was here to help us celebrate that. So I mentioned TCCR, tank closure cesium removal, we call it TICR, is an ion exchange process. It duplicates the technology, some of the technology that was used to clean up wastewater at Fukushima. Ion exchange is a fairly mature technology. The resin is a fairly new thing as far as being used in nuclear service. Again, it's crystalline silicon titanate. It is an expensive resin, so you want to get as much cesium on it as you can. But with the technology the way it developed at Fukushima, we felt we could bring something right to the side of the tank. So we had a vendor design this what amounts to a Sealand container, designed it at their facility, brought it here, placed it directly beside the tank, and are pumping from the tank high-level waste through the resin columns, taking off the cesium, and sending the decontaminated salt solution to Saltstone. From the time the requisition was placed to the time we actually put it in service was less than 2.5 years, which is, again, for the DOE complex, is a very, very outstanding turnaround time. And we've processed over 200,000 gallons of radioactive waste with that material. Now, again, as Mike said in his opening comments, the system has worked very well, and you'll hear a little bit about that later. What we've had problems with is tank 10, the one we're trying to dissolve the salt in, had gone through several dissolution campaigns in the ancient history times. So a lot of the really soluble salt has been removed, and we're finding it very hard to dissolve up this salt. So we're putting a new transfer pump in it to run the rest of the material, and we're also going to put a couple of mixing pumps in that tank to be able to churn up all that material to finish the final heel removal in that tank. I think the last time you had an overview was about 18 months ago from my boss, Tom Foster, and he spent quite a little bit of time talking about 3H Evaporator. 3H Evaporator is one of our workhorses for removing water from the system. We had a failure of that unit back in early 2016. And what happens is evaporators, to get good evaporation, not only have their steam coils in them, which is right here, but they have air spargers in them. And these air spargers make sure that the fluid's being mixed and make sure no solids build up at the bottom of the cone. Well, this particular vessel is the only vessel that we've got made out of Hastelloy. Hastelloy is extraordinarily good for corrosion, and that's why you get it. it's a little bit softer than normal stainless steels. So it actually eroded part of the bottom of the evaporator out. So we went through, working with Areva, we went through a lot of remote technologies for putting a new bottom on this, which worked very well. But then we found two small defects that also were leaking. After discussions, making a presentation to the department, they agreed we could put that vessel back in service with the proviso that we go order a new one, because we needed that vessel to keep our liquid volumes down. We have a vessel on order, and that's good, but 3H has been a real workhorse and worked very well with no increase in those very, very tiny leak sites. In fact, you just barely see a little bit of salt pile up. You really don't see any water coming out of any of the holes. And so we processed almost 1 million gallons in this fiscal year with this vessel, and about 1.6 million gallons total through all of our evaporators. So it's been a very successful year from an evaporator point of view. Saltstone production facility. Again, when most of the radioactivity has been removed from the liquid, that liquid is, we call it decontaminated salt solution, is transported to the salt processing facility. This is not actually a picture of the salt processing facility. This is a picture of the silos where the raw materials are fed to SWPF. And Aaron Stopp, who works for me, is going to give you a presentation on some of the innovations that we've done. But one of the things you have to do is you have to get all those feed materials, which includes cement and fly ash and slag. You have to get all them suspended, and you actually air convey them over to the grout hopper. So we've installed 3 brand new compressors, because the original compressors that were installed in there were installed in the late 80s. And so they're bigger, they handle a lot more air, and there's 3 of them instead of 2 of them, because we have 3 components, and we need to slurry up all 3 of them at the same time to have the highest production rate that we possibly can. And we need a very high production rate out of this facility. We also will have several other things that Aaron will talk to you about, but also this is one facility where we have a lot of capacity that's not used. We run this on a 1 shift only. We've already hired a 2nd shift. We'll run it 2 shifts as soon as SWPF starts up, and both of those shift crews are ready. When they get closer to startup, we'll actually hire a 3rd shift crew, and we'll have at least 3 shift crews to handle all of the material that will be coming from SWPF, which will be 7, 8, 9, 10 million gallons of decontaminated salt solution, plus maybe another 1 or 2 million gallons from the ticker units. So we'll handle it with at least 3 shifts, and depending on how that goes and what kind of rates we see, we have the capability of going to a full 4 shift with that facility. Saltstone disposal units are the ultimate destination of this grout material. So you make this cement or concrete-like material, and then you have to bury it. And it'll eventually, this is permitted by the state as a landfill. So very little radioactivity, a lot of chemicals involved in what goes into each one of these. We originally were building the SDUs in what I'll call the small size. We didn't think they were small at the time, because these are 150 foot in diameter, 22 foot tall, hold about 2.8 million gallons of grout. They're commercially designed water tank. A city water system might have them either on their clean water side or on their wastewater side. When you realize that you have to eventually dispose of probably 200 million gallons of decontaminated salt solution, you recognize that you have to build 80 or 90 of those. And so we got smart, and the largest available commercial design in normal production is what we call our mega SDUs. It is a 32 million gallon tank, 375 foot in diameter, 43 feet tall. It's big enough to hold a football field or a baseball stadium if you needed to. And it'll hold over 32 million gallons of grout. So rather than building 88 of those, we're building these. And when Tom came and spoke to you 18 months ago, we were just finishing that one up. Since then, we're this far into building SDU 7. So it's 25 walls, it's 11 floor sections, 7 roof sections, and over 208 columns that go into this. I'll also point out that when we built this 4-pack, which in total gets you about 11 million gallons of grout volume, when you compare it to the cost of one of these, building 4 of these was the same cost as building 1 of these. You get $11 million with 11 million gallons of grout capacity with these. You get 32 million gallons of grout capacity with this. So you're getting 3 times the capacity for the same price. That's why we went this way. You can see in the picture that we've already started the work on SDU 8's position. There's already a mud mat in place for this. And if I had the latest picture, you'd see that same cutout for SDU 9, which will go here. All in preparation for SWPF and the large volumes coming out of it. Eventually, it will all look like that. And that, we believe, will handle all of the decontaminated salt solution. That landfill, when it's all finished, will be capped and closed. So just a couple more slides. You might have seen this one before. This is the gear chart, as we call it. And SWPF compared to MCU ARP, as I've said, is a much higher capacity. So it's not just another gear coming in, it's a very large gear coming in. And everything else in the liquid waste program has to run faster at a higher capacity than it's ever run before. And I want to show you a couple of things that come out of that. First, let's see, how does that show up from the back? Probably not too well. This shows you most of the liquid waste program. This is generally true north here. This is the Saltstone facility. You can see a couple of the small SDUs, and SDU 6 would be right behind that. Right here is the Defense Waste Processing Facility. Here is SWPF. Here, just for a point of reference, is H Canyon with HP line on top of it. And then laid out here in front of you is H Tank Farm, about half of it. And then 2 other important buildings I want to point out is what we call Low Point, or 511S and 512S. They were 2 small buildings built between tank farms and DWPF, particularly for pumping sludge, which is very, very thick. You have to pump it to one point, put it in a tank, pump it up to that point, put it in a tank, pump it up from that point, and put it in DWPF. But this shows you where we're doing a lot of work to get ready for SWPF. Parsons has responsibility for getting the building ready and the process ready, but we have responsibility for getting it all hooked up and the rest of the liquid waste program ready. So we've got 2 large 120,000 gallon tankage space in Saltstone to handle the increased DSS solution we'll get. We're putting the purge mods in that I mentioned earlier, lab waste handling and DWPF. We're doing the final tie-ins. We tied in this is the feed line to DWPF, or to SWPF, and this takes the really concentrated products and ships those over to DWPF from SWPF. So we've tied in right there. We've tied in here at Tank 50, which transfers DSS to Saltstone, and also will take DSS from SWPF. And we've tied in here also. So 3 major tie-ins have been completed. purge mods, salt receipt tanks, and we've also placed ARP MCU in full layout. And this is just that same view rotated about 90 degrees that shows you where all those major tie-ins were done. All right. There may be a test, so. One other big point I wanted to make is once you get it tied in, there's a whole lot of management that has to go on in being able to get ready for SWPF. And this is just an example of trying to get first 3 million gallons ready, then 6 million gallons ready, then 9 million gallons a year ready for SWPF. This is a card that we produce. It is all 51 of our waste tanks, 1 through 51. These 4 were the first 4 put in service in 1953 and 54, and these were the last 4 put in service in the late 70s. You can see the 8 tanks that are closed, 5, 6, 12, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. So that leaves us 43 operational tanks to hold 35 million gallons of high-level waste. And the tanks range from 750,000 gallons up to the largest one's about 1.3 million gallons. So on average, they're about 1 million gallons. So all those colors mean a lot, but it means that it's very full. And some of the tanks, 51 and 40. 40 is the sludge feed tank to DWPF, so it's dedicated to that. 51 prepares the sludge for feed to 40 that makes the next batch. So sludge batch 10 is here, sludge batch 11 is here for DWPF. So those are out of service for salt processing. Tanks 49 will be the SWPF feed tank. The next one after that is tank 21. And then I apologize for these colors not showing up as good as I would have liked them to. Everything but these red lines indicate some sludge in the bottom of several of these tanks. Everything else is some form of material that needs to go through SWPF. Some of it is in liquid form, dissolved salt. Most of it, which if you can see this pinkish color, is undissolved salt. It's salt cake. So most of it is in a hard salt that has to be dissolved. And when you dissolve salt, it takes about 3 times as much water to get you if you dissolve 1 million gallons of salt, you're going to end up with 3 or 4 million gallons of salt solution. And there isn't a whole lot of room to put it anywhere. So you have to break some eggs. We have to get SWPF started up, take that material off to free up room for the next set of tanks. So the way that'll be handled, this one's a different color scheme, so I apologize. So the way we're set up right now is 49 is the feed tank with 21 is the blend tank. We have 1 million gallons of salt solution ready to go. It's been sampled. The paperwork's all been completed. We're going to turn it over to Parsons and the DOE to approve it as the first feed batch for SWPF. So 1 million gallons ready to go. 21 has 1 million gallons of SWPF ready feed made up in it, ready to go. It's been sampled. SRNL is doing the analysis on it. When we get those analyses back in about a month, we'll put all the paperwork together. There'll be 2 million gallons of SWPF feed ready. The rest of the feed material comes from some of these tanks, And to be able to do that feed, every one of those tanks has to have a transfer pump in it to get it to tank 21. Tank 21's got to have a transfer pump and a blend pump to get it 40 to 49. 49's got to have a transfer pump to get it to SWPF. So there's a lot of infrastructure that has to exist. Some of these tanks will require 3 mixing pumps, which mixing pump can cost you anywhere from $800,000 to $2 million to install on each and every tank. And some cases you need 3 of those. Eventually, to get up over just maybe 3 million gallons a year, you have to have 2 blend tanks. So we're in the process of dissolving salt right now in 41 to make it the second. There's that, of all those tanks I showed you on that busy slide, this has the least amount of salt on it. So we'll dissolve the salt up on that so that you have blend tank, 2 blend tanks. So salt batch 1 is here, salt batch 2 will be here, salt batch 3 will be here, and then we'll alternate back and forth so that you always have one feeding the feed tank and you always have one that's being made up and being sampled. And then that increases the number of hub tanks that you need to be able to feed those, because you have 3 feed sources. You not only have salt, you have concentrate from the evaporators, and you have leachate from our sludge washing processes. And then the final configuration, you really want to have 3 blend tanks so that you're using one to feed the feed tank, you're using one that's already made up and sampled and getting ready, and then you want one where you're actually making it up. And that will get you to 9 million gallons a year, which we hope to support for SWPF. This configuration we're in now. This configuration we plan to be in 6 to 8 months, and then this configuration is somewhere between 12 and 18 months away. And again, I want to emphasize the importance of the infrastructure behind all those tanks. All those tanks need multiple pumps to be able to support the amount of salt that we need. So let me close my talk. Summary. ARP MCU is a big success story for us. Ran over a decade on something that was planned to go for 2 or 3 years. Processed over 7.8 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste. So we're very pleased with its operation, and we're happy to have placed it in a safe standby state. The SDU construction, as you can see from those pictures, is going very well and will fully support the SWPF mission when it starts up. Our core function is focused on us being ready for SWPF when it starts up. So you saw all the information I had on the tie-ins and all the facility improvements that we're doing around it to get ready for that very, very high volume that will be coming out of SWPF, including the piping for all the tie-ins is complete. The electrical work is ongoing, electrical checkouts are ongoing, and we're expecting to be fully ready, declare readiness for whatever and whenever SWPF starts up. We'll be ready by Thanksgiving of this year. And then, as I showed you there, we'll, in a phased way, get up to work up from 3 million gallons a year to 9 million gallons of feed and DSS out of SWPF within the next 18 months. That concludes my presentation.
All right, so as we move into questions, I just want to remind everybody further down the agenda today, we do have presentations on Saltstone, SWPF, and Ticker. So I know that Mark covered some of those areas today, and you may want to ask him some questions. I'm not going to tell you not to, but just keep in mind that we're going to go into a lot more detail after lunch today. Dave, I saw your card go up first, so we'll start with you, sir.
Dave Isley, Cap. Mark, thank you. And man, that's just awesome what you all have already done and what you're moving into. That's really difficult management right there. We appreciate it. You talked about the large volume of water that you have to use to assist you with your dissolutions and such as that. Do you try and steal water from some of the existing sources, like you got the evaporator, you got ETF, and recycle from DWPF? You know, can you use that, or is that just too much trouble to try and recover?
Did you
that?
used to work in liquid waste?
I know a little something about the site.
Yes, we do everything we can to do that. So putting fresh water in the system is sort of our enemy. We don't want to do
Yeah.
that. So recycle is one source. Water that we use to wash sludge is another source. Those are the biggest ones we use to try and not put more water in the system. But eventually, in the end, you will put more water in the system.
Well, I get that. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The other enemy of putting water in the system, it all has to be boiled right back off in DWPF, because no water goes in glass. It just recycles back to the tank farm.
I get it. You're using it. That's the question, and that's good. Thank you.
Every drop we can, we reuse.
Jim Gill.
Jim Gill, CAP. I'm looking at slide 18.
You ready for the test?
There. Yeah, am I reading it correctly that the brown shading, like tank 1, 4, 5, et cetera, indicates those tanks have leaks?
Yes. There are several tanks that have leaks. We don't operate a liquid tank above the leak point. And there are some tanks that have salt, dried salt in them, where the leak point is below the level of the salt. But when we actually go in and go after that salt to dissolve it, we do a detailed notification to DOE and to the state that we're about to go do that activity. And we have a recycle from the secondary back into the primary of the vessel before we do any of those activities.
Are some of the tanks single wall and don't have a secondary containment?
So all of them have a pan on the outside of them. Some of them do not have full secondary.
And are those on any kind of a priority for getting closed?
Yes, all of the old style, you'll notice that everything that's closed is in those top 3 rows. Those are the ones on the priority list. All those that were closed, most of those that were already closed had some significant leak issue with them.
Thank you.
Okay. Candace.
Candace Cave, CAP. On slide 18, just to clarify, does the red line indicate the proportion of sludge in the tank? Is that why they're different thicknesses?
Yes. Yeah, I know there's no chance you can see it, but it actually has, most of these have a 0.3300. We measure it in inches.
Thank you.
So some of them have as much as a couple of feet, some of them have just a few inches of sludge in them.
Okay. Charles.
Charles Hilton, CAP. Thank you for this presentation. It's fascinating. Page 6, it talks about the double stack, the canister storage. There's one sentence that jumped out at me: create safe interim storage through fiscal year 2029. That's 9 years from now. It's not a whole lot of time. It goes back to long-term storage. Is this something that is just a political decision that's going to have to be made?
Well, the canisters for final disposition need a federal repository. And that was to be Yucca Mountain. That's to be determined now. So until there is a federal repository, they're likely to stay right there.
Okay. Maybe the concern is safe storages through 2029. I'm assuming the safe storage is forever.
It means we have enough space through 2029. It'll be safe forever.
Okay.
Not forever, but for an extended period of time. You do want these canisters eventually in a repository somewhere.
Yes, we do. The other question deals with slide 9, and I apologize for my lack of knowledge of these processes. Does Ticker do basically the same thing as the SWPF, just a different methodology?
So a couple things. SWPF has a much larger capability for its decontamination factor. It will remove a lot more, not a lot more, but significantly more cesium than Ticker is capable of. So Ticker would be used for very low concentration cesium streams. Okay? Ticker also has no capability to remove strontium, which SWPF does. It has a little bit of a capability to remove actinides that are insoluble, but it has no capability of really removing soluble actinides.
Thank you.
Okay. Dave Avakis.
Dave Bacchus, CAP, thank you for your presentation. On slide 14, you showed us what the SDUs will look like in the future. And then I think you said when the project is finished, the landfill will be capped and enclosed.
That's correct.
Is that different than what we see here?
Yes. The fourth picture of this would be a grass-covered hill. So you'll have to get all the dirt to cover all those up. And they're actually dug into the ground. They're about half below the grade level. But you'll put a dirt cap, probably a lined dirt cap, depending on what permit process we go through with the state, a line cap that will cover that entire area.
Thank you.
Okay. Dan?
Dan Kaminsky, Cab. On slide 18, just the asterisks on the tank numbers, it says it's BWRE complete on these tanks. What does BWRE stand for?
In the FFA, there's a term called bulk waste removal. And that indicates when we have, it's not a well-defined term, but the majority of the waste removed that's easily removed. So in tank 10, I think we've removed the majority of the waste that's easily removed. So we're trying to declare bulk waste removal complete on tank 10. You have to put larger pumps or some other different technology in there, and that's really the real key point is there's a transition of technology to get the final dregs out of the tank.
Is that bulk in volume or radionuclides?
Yes.
Both. Okay.
Okay. Betty?
Betty Cook, CAB, thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation. And I have a question that's off the chart here. We're talking about processing, receiving, processing, storing, but where are we receiving this waste from, and are we currently receiving waste?
There is very few influence into the high-level waste process right now, and there won't be any in the future. Of significant volume. Almost all of this volume comes from the startup of the canyons in the early 50s, processing during the Cold War, that was completed in the early 90s. We have small volume that we still get from H Canyon that goes into the system. It's a very small amount. It's less than 200,000 gallons a year, and I think it's average less than 100,000 gallons a year. And we evaporate that down so that it's a very insignificant quantity. We do run, I think I mentioned the effluent treatment facility, which is a wastewater plant. It's permitted through the state that way. That does take very lightly contaminated materials from rainwater runoff from the tank farms, from the canyon. It actually takes a little bit of material from tritium. That the evaporator bottoms from that go into the tank farms also. But again, those volumes aren't very large at all. So almost all of this is legacy waste.
Thank you.
Gil.
Gil Onsworth, Captain. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's one of the best presentations we've had on the whole liquid waste program in 5 years I've been here. But I got a few questions. People I talk to like to hear about tank closure. So, you know, when I know we're just looking at the test sheet, what you called it, but it's easy to look. I'm looking at tank 4, 8, 11, and 14. Are we going to be able to close those? I mean, I'm just looking at the colors and but I mean, people talk to me and they say, you know, when are tanks going to be closed?
Right. So obviously we're in a little bit of a hiatus on tank closure, and that was really should have been my key point of we're down to 41 tanks with 5 million gallons of waste. We need to keep that space available right now to make up salt solution. Because again, to dissolve the salt, I need to make up dissolve 1 million gallons of salt, I needed 4 million gallons of volume to get it all into. I personally believe the most likely candidates are the tanks that will empty with ticker for the next tanks. So that would be tank 10, and then you'll hear a little bit more about ticker, but we're hooking up tank 9 to be the next tank. So 10 and 9, because they're disconnected from everything else, and I really can't make salt up in them because they're just harder to get to, will be the next ones that will probably be like on the closure list.
Any guesstimate of a timeline?
I can look in the system plan and see when we put them in.
Fine.
I don't have it off the top of my head.
And then I had a second question, and it may be an SWPF question, but so SWPF is going to be able to process 9 million gallons a year?
That's the goal.
That's the goal. And so
I believe the last the baseline value is about 7 million.
One of the issues that the cab had when SWPF was being discussed was were you going to be able to provide the fuel, the waste to actually have SWPF? Do you still feel confident you're going to be able to provide 7 million gallons a year?
That was really the key point among these three slides.
Mm-hmm.
We've got 2 million ready.
2 million ready.
2 million ready. We'll have 3 million in short order, and when I go to those blend tanks, 2 blend tanks, I'll be able to switch back and forth with all of that salt that's available. Should be no problem. Getting to this will be a little tougher because I need to get a third tank open and available. So you see 41 actually gets promoted. We need to get all the salt out of it, moved to other tanks, and then it'll get promoted to a blend tank, and we'll be able to go back and forth between those. And then 42, we get all the salt out of that, it gets promoted to a blend tank, and we'll be able to probably pretty easily keep up with 9 million gallons from the blend tanks. We got to be able to dissolve it out of these tanks, which means we have to have at least 3, if not 4 4 pumps in each and every one of these tanks to keep up with that. That's where my biggest concern is, making sure that we have the money in the infrastructure of pumps to be able to get those.
And this is what you're driving for by Thanksgiving?
By Thanksgiving, we'll be ready to feed SWPF.
Okay.
All right, so
Great. Thank you.
we're a little bit over, but we've got a few more questions left. Sonny has a comment to make, then we'll go to Bobby and then Malcolm, and then we're going to move on to our next topic for the day.
Yes, good morning. This is Sunny Blanco, Department of Energy. I just wanted to bring a couple of things as clarification and answers. Gil, as far as tank closure is concerned, the reason you don't see us closing tanks this year, next year, actually revision 21 of the system plan says that we're going to be closing tanks around FY 24, 25. It's because we need SWPF working so we can be able to start again closing tanks. And that's going to happen around FY 24, FY 25 is when the next couple of tanks are scheduled to be closing. And we'll be making decisions on which ones are going to be the best ones to be closed based on the ticker operation and what are the tanks that we actually can do without as far as preparing salt for SWPF. Also, I just wanted to clarify about the tanks that have leak sites, and Mark described that very well. But as far as the secondary containment, we do have the type 4 tanks that do not have secondary containment, and they're single shell tanks. We have still working tanks 21 through 24, and they're actively being used, as you see, for preparation of salt waste for SWPF, salt solution, but they do not have leak sites, and they are actually very good to us right now. So I just wanted to clarify your point about the old style tanks. Obviously, they are our priority for tank closure at this time, and we have closed a good many of them that had leak sites or leak history. But the contractor is managing the ones that are left that have leak sites very well, as far as keeping the waste that is in the tank below the leak site, and those that have salt cake, based on the ventilation system and methods they use, those leak sites are kept sealed. So, and then we get the regulating agencies involved when we are ready to work on those tanks that have leak sites, because the leak site might become active. But then they have methods to keep the waste to be released to the environment. So we can actually work the tank and then proceed with closure. Okay.
Thanks, Sonny. All right, Bobby.
Bobby Williams, cab. On slide 18, tank 48 has precipitate in it. What's going on with that tank? And my second question is, you have personnel in training for a startup of SWPF. How many people do you have in training, and are you training them with simulators, or how are you training them?
So the second question first. We have a whole group that we hired. I don't know the exact number, but I think we hired about 40 in each group, about 3 different groups of operators that have been distributed between the tank farm, DWPF, and Saltstone. All 3 of those facilities have simulators, and we are utilizing those as part of the training program. There's a lot of classroom training, and everybody, all the operators that we hire go through fundamentals classes, include fluid flow, heat transfer, those types of, those things that they need a little bit more than what they got in their high school or associate's degree class. So we put them through fundamentals, we put them through facility-specific training. We give them what we call job performance measures, which is actually performing with a procedure out in the field with the oversight of a trainer or a trained operator, and then we also do simulator work. So, and repeat the first question again.
Tank 48 has precipitate in it.
Okay.
It's the only one that has precipitate.
Right. So the very original process for cleaning up salt was something called in-tank precipitation. It used a chemical that precipitated out cesium. That process was decided to be abandoned. This goes back, I don't even know now, 20 years, 25 years now, abandoned because of the amount of hydrogen and benzene it produced. So it's just sitting as a quiet tank, and eventually it will have to be processed somewhere. It is not active under our contract except to monitor it.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bobby. Malcolm.
Malcolm Phillips, cab. I just have a general question. I know that what you're going to be about is transferring a great amount of radioactive, highly corrosive liquid into various regions across the site, which obviously plays into potential accident considerations with regard to accidental leaks of significance. Historically, what has been the record on that score, and what are you doing to try to anticipate that and minimize the risk?
Well, we have operators and mechanics, and whenever there are people involved in following procedures, which are we have extensive procedures, but the chance for an error does exist. On important steps, we do what we call peer verification, or we have independent verification, or we'll have something like a QA hold point. In as many of our processes as we can, as we're hooking them up to SWPF, we're putting automatic controls in place, interlocks, radiation detectors, things like that, to prevent any addition to the wrong tank or the transferring to the wrong area or anything like that. So we look at that very, very carefully, but it's something, again, as you work with people, you have to do everything you can to help them not make an error.
How about the equipment itself? I mean, you're talking now about people, and I understand human error is a major portion of accidents, but also the corrosive nature of the liquid. And we see it in nuclear power plants where there's leaks occur because of the corrosive nature of the liquid on bends, among other things. Is that a consideration?
It certainly is, and generally we work with materials of construction like a Hastelloy or stainless steels that can handle that environment, and then our pumps and things like that will go through some kind of dynamic testing with that type of material to make sure that they work well under those environments. All of our process equipment gets classified. Some of it we call safety class, and some of it we call safety significant, and then we have production support. If it's a safety significant or safety class piece of equipment, then there's all sorts of surveillances that go along with it to make sure that that equipment doesn't have failures while it's needed for operation.
And final question, if you don't mind. I'd like to go into that further, but I'll put that aside. The final question is, this is a process that's apparently working well, and I'm certain that there are other sites within the DOE complex that have the exact same considerations or problems that Savannah River has. Is this being transported to other sites, or is there a potential that this site will become a repository for other sites utilizing it, so to speak?
Certainly the WTP process at Hanford. Hanford is a sister site to the Savannah River site. It was actually built before the Savannah River site by DuPont, and DuPont was asked to build this site. So the processes and the things that they're using out there are very similar to ours. They're just way behind us because it was decided to do the high-level waste mission here first because we had less, we only did Purex and HM process and a few other similar processes in our two canyons. Hanford had, I think, 9 different canyons, and they have 50-some million gallons of waste, and they have a much more difficult operation and a much bigger operation. So they're still many years from startup out there, whereas we've been running the DWPF for 25 years now, and we'll be taking care of all of our salt waste here with the startup of SWPF.
I would love to ask a question about lessons learned across the sites, but I know...
We visit them regularly, and they visit us regularly.
All right, Charles, I'm going to let you close it out. Last one.
I'm not sure I've heard the correct answer. My understanding was from Sonia's presentation that the next tank closure is 2024. That concerns me greatly. It's been 8 years. I know we're in a transitional period with repurposing tanks to meet the new facility and going online, and hopefully we accelerate it. But the last tank closure was 4/28/2016, and we're looking at 8 years to close another tank at a cost of $1.5 billion, I think, budget a year, and we're not closing tanks. Concerns me.
Yeah, and that was part of the reason for this card. It's not necessarily a question of money. It's a question, it's a technical thing. I don't have any space. I don't have any empty tanks to close. So I have to have SWPF running, get the salt out of the system, then I can have empty tanks and we can close them.
I understand that. Still concerns me.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.
All right. So next up, we have Aaron White, and he's going to give us a regulatory update. She'll get it pulled up in just a second.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you guys for being here. My name is Aaron White, and I am the Senior Technical Program Manager for Waste Disposition and Tank Closure. And there are a couple things I want to speak to you about before we get started. The first of all is, as I go through my presentation, there's going to be a lot of acronyms. I apologize up front about that. This is government work, and we use a lot of big words over and over again, so we have to use these acronyms. So I'll do my best to explain them and define them to you as we go along, but please forgive me if I forget, or halfway through it, you guys forget what one of them are, so it happens. The other thing is, as we're going to be talking about the regulatory program, I'm going to be speaking a lot about the dispute resolution process. Now, we don't have a lot of time to go into all the intricate details of that process, but one thing I want you to fully understand is the fact that just because we have a dispute, or we're disputing an issue or a milestone or a concept, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a process that we use to interact with our regulators, to document our decisions and move forward. And the third concept I want you to remember is came out of Mark's presentation, which is the big focus with the Salt Waste Processing Facility, or SWPF. In order for us to meet our cleanup goals to close tanks, as I stated, my job title is tank closure, so it hurts me the fact that we are not going to be closing any tanks for several years, but the process to get to that point requires the Salt Waste Processing Facility, so we will be moving towards that. All right, so for outline of my presentation, there are two big umbrella regulatory documents or frameworks that we operate under. The first one is the FFA, or the Federal Facilities Agreement. The biggest thing that happened this past year under the FFA was the suspension agreement, and I'll get into some detail about that and some history associated with it. The other large regulatory framework that we operate under are our state permits. And there's a number of permits associated with, in particular, the F-tank farm and the H-tank farm, as well as our saltstone disposal facility. And then at the very end of my presentation, I'll get into a little bit of discussion about some of the other regulatory agencies that we interact with. As you remember before, this is our liquid waste system, and the key parts that I interact specifically with our regulators are associated with our active tank systems, as well as the closed tanks and our saltstone disposal facility. So, as I mentioned before, our interaction with our regulators are focused on getting to tank closure. So we've got to get the waste out of our tanks and dispose of and get these tanks closed. Almost shut something up. So I put a link to the FFA on the presentation in case anybody's interested. It's a very large document. But the key point that I want you all to get out of this is the fact that in support of our environmental restoration activities at the Savannah River site, the FFA is a agreement between the DOE, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, and the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. And those three agencies agreed to, sat down and came up with the plan to clean up this site. And a key concept to remember is the fact that where the site, the liquid waste program is only a small portion of the cleanup activities that take place at the site. So in order to clean up the entire site, so when you look at the whole Savannah River site, you want to look at it as a large system, and cleaning up the tanks, cleaning up our salt waste is just a small portion. Working with our regulators, we've gotten them to understand, and we all understand that it takes a teamwork effort. Okay, so in 2017, we ended up sitting down with our regulators and putting together a suspension agreement. What the suspension agreement was regarding was there was a comprehensive plan and schedule for closing the old style tanks in the liquid waste system. And as a result of a number of issues, in particular, the delayed startup of the salt waste processing facility, we decided to put a suspension on all the milestones associated with tank closure. And the goal was to set up an aggressive schedule for resetting these milestones based off of all the new information and the new liquid waste prime contractor. However, in 2019, earlier this year, as we sat down to the table and took a look at our budgets and took a look at the fact that the new liquid waste contractor the new liquid waste contract had not been awarded, as well as the fact that SWPF still had not started up, we sat down at the table and said, okay, well, we're not in a great position to set realistic milestones that are achievable and will show a lot of progress. So let's suspend all remaining milestones until we have this new information, and keep the plan to pursue a new schedule once the new contract is awarded, once SWPF is in operation. And as we do that, we'll set some more intra milestones of cleanup goals across the site. So as a part of that negotiation, we came up with a number of additional milestones. I know, as I stated before, and as was mentioned before, closing tanks is a high priority. However, just because we're not closing tanks does not mean that we're not cleaning up the site. Does not mean that we cannot show progress of some of the other cleanup activities and some of the other things that we're doing at the Savannah River site. So as a part of our negotiation with our regulators, we came up with a number of additional milestones that we can include into the FFA and set time limits to make these things occur. And some of them are shown here. The first is F-Tank Farm Deactivation Plan, which is a plan to sit down and say, okay, this is exactly what, when we say we're going to close the F-Tank Farm, what does that mean? What will F-Tank Farm look like once all the waste is gone and we're handing it over to area closure to eventually put a cap on? And also, because we have not gone through the closure process, what are some of the closure process on our tanks? What are some of the things that we can do or work through that closure process on? And one of the ideas that we came up with were the ancillary structures. The ancillary structures are things like the 1F evaporator, which has not been in operation for years. We have a number of diversion boxes and pump pits and catch tanks, and these are all structures in the tank farms that have not been used for years. and they're identified in the FFA for closure. So let's walk through that entire closure process to make sure that everybody involved is still aware of that process. Let's go through this process and close some of these other structures in the meantime until we can get to closing some tanks. We also included some additional environmental work across the complex, or across the site, such as accelerating the treatability study associated with the D area groundwater operable unit, as well as submitting a decommissioning project final report for the partial decommissioning of 690N, which is a facility in N area, right? So as we got into the suspension agreement, we stated that the key thing to get out of the next agreement will be to set a new comprehensive plan and schedule for closing tanks with realistic dates and a true timeline. This negotiation will start once 30 days after the notice to proceed for the next liquid waste contract award. We also want to transfer some of the beneficial activities that were identified from all the other previous dispute resolution agreements. If you look at Appendix L of the FFA, there's a number of extension requests and dispute resolution agreements, and the suspension agreements are there as well. So these were all different times that we sat down with our regulators and came up with processes and new information, and we wanted to roll that all into a single new agreement. The goal for this the goal to complete these new negotiations will be in 9/30/2022. All right. As I just mentioned before, some of the beneficial activities that we came up with as a part of the dispute resolution process well, we've got what's known as the March 9th report, which is something that we do for our active tank systems, for all of the active tanks and all of the different facilities in the liquid waste program. We have to provide a status of that program throughout of all the things that happened over that past year. This is basically a page out of the March 9th report. And as you can see, there's a detailed analysis of how much available space is in the tank, how much salt, waste, and sludge is included. The previous discussion spoke a lot about the leak sites that were identified in some of the tanks. Well, as a part of our negotiation with our regulators, came an annual radioactive waste tank inspection program. This inspection program is set throughout the year, where we do tank integrity analysis as well as leak site inspections to determine. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, right here. If you can barely see right here, but it shows the date of the discovery of the leak. How much waste was captured on the annulus floor. One thing I want to also point out is when we refer to leak, we're not referring to leaks into the environment. We're referring to leaks that are coming from the primary tank into this annulus area right here, right? And now we also have these cooling coils. That's the image that's shown there. So. All right, so not only do we do these inspections for the active tank systems, but we also do inspections of our closed tank systems, where we go ahead and do inspections, and we take a number of pictures and compare the pictures over the years or from the past year to determine if there's any change, are there any maintenance activities that are necessary. Over the years, South Carolina DHEC as well as the EPA have participated in these inspections as well. Okay, so that was a lot of information about the things that occur under the FFA. Now, some of the things that occur under our liquid waste permits are, and as you can see in this image, there are a lot of different permits for a lot of the different activities that take place in the GSA, which is the General Separations Area, with the middle portion of the Savannah River site. But the two ones that I want you to focus on or that I'll be speaking a lot about are here, which is the industrial wastewater construction permit for F-tank farm and H-tank farm, which includes all waste tanks, evaporator systems, diversion boxes, pump pits, transfer lines, and associated tanks, pumps, and piping, as well as our Z area Class 3 industrial solid waste landfill permit. So this is the permit that covers the saltstone disposal facility, which could include specifically the saltstone disposal units. And this is the permit that captures all of our waste tanks. So as I mentioned before, our goal in the liquid waste program is to close tanks, right? And the permit describes the process that we use to do that. The Consolidated General Closure Plan is the document that was agreed to with the regulators to identify the state environmental requirements and provide guidance to remove what we call in the permit and the FFA we call to remove from service. Remove from service basically means to close our tanks. So the Consolidated General Closure Plan is the process that we use, this is the document that describes the process for closing these tanks. This process is briefly described in this image, and again, I could talk for hours and hours about each one of these steps, but as a very high-level presentation, we go from safe storage, which is where we are for the majority of our tanks right now, to bulk waste removal efforts, like as was discussed previously, getting the easily removed salt out of the tanks. Then we get to what's known as heel removal, which is getting the harder to remove wastes out of the tanks, flushing the cooling coils, cleaning the analysts, the sides of the tank. Once all of that's done and we've got regulator agreement, then we move to isolation, which is separating that tank from the rest of the liquid waste system, residual sampling, getting all the analysis necessary to properly understand what's being left or what is being left in the tank, and that what is left can be kept protective over years. Then we get to operational closure, which is grouting. So all those are associated with the F-tank farm and the H-tank farm permits. Under the saltstone disposal facility, the landfill permit, there were specific conditions or special conditions related to reporting what's known as the inventory, which is what's left in the tank, as well as the initiation of the ARP MCU facility, as well as initiation of the salt waste processing facility, or SWPF. DHEC and the Department of Energy went into a dispute over that last special condition, but what came out of it were what's known as the supplemental tank closure activities, of which ticker was one of those. And then there was also an agreement to process 36.75 million gallons of liquid waste between 2016 and 2022. And that was a very optimistic goal for processing, and we all knew that. So as a part of that agreement, we included a reduced processing rates where justified and approved by the DHEC. That justification process is what we commonly refer to as our force majeure reporting process. Now, force majeure in general industry terms or insurance terms is basically like an act of God, which could be such as a hurricane or lightning strikes. But for the purposes of our reporting process, force majeures were anything that could significantly affect our processing rates. And our justification process is basically a three-step process. The first step is where we provide notification. This will be a notification of any little thing, not any little thing, but any justifiable thing that has occurred that could potentially cause a reduction or a pause or a halt of processing. This could be something from unplanned outage in one of the steam plants, or a major equipment malfunction that led to an outage where you stopped work to repair that process. Then we have a quarterly report that we issue in which we may elevate those conditions into specific events. Again, not all of these activities will lead to a pause in processing. Maybe there was an unplanned maybe there was a unplanned steam outage that occurred at the same time that they were doing some other equipment repair. In that event, then we could identify that, yes, we notified the regulators saying that this was potentially an issue, but because we were already paused, there was no need to elevate that particular event. However, if there was a domestic water line we were processing and there was an unplanned water outage where the domestic water line was leaking and they had to stop to repair that leak, then we may submit that elevation of the condition into event in this quarterly report. And at the end of the year, we issue an annual report that captures a summary of all of those quarterly reports. And by doing that, we can, there's some interesting calculations associated with that, but by doing that, we can take the production impacts, which would be the force majeure reporting credits, associated with how much we've actually produced that year to meet our agreement total. Again, the agreement total is the 36.75 million gallons until due by FY 2022. But the breakdown that was used to make this 36.75 number is identified right here. And as of the end of FY 18, so this would be September 30th of 2018, we had an actual production of 1.66 million gallons processed of this 36.75 million, and production impacted 3.14 million gallons. Okay, now to speak a little bit about some of the other regulatory agencies that we interact with, we also deal with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the headquarters, DOE headquarters organization, the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Disposal Facility Federal Review Group. Again, one of my most favorite acronyms, the LFROG. Okay, so in the arena that we interact with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, this is all under what's known as the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA, Section 3116, which basically is what a part of the process that allows us to treat and dispose of our radioactive waste. But the NRC comes in and performs monitoring activities to ensure that we're doing exactly what we say we're doing and operating safely. I included here is a graph of some of their monitoring factors that they look at, but primarily the things that they're interested in are how we're calculating our inventory, the processes for which that inventory can be released, and some of the processes that we're using to describe our closure cap, because the only way that that waste will be transported is through water infiltration from the cap post-closure. And that's true for both our tank farms and our salt waste disposal facility. And finally, the other organization is with headquarters called the LFROG. And the LFROG provides regulatory oversight that's identified in our DOE order to confirm the disposal of low-level radioactive waste in all DOE facilities, as well as resulting from tank closures, to make sure that those activities are conducted in a manner that is protective of health and safety of the environment. And in order to make that determination, there's a large suite of modeling, mathematical modeling, computer modeling, hypothetical situations that are used in what's known as a performance assessment to identify that the waste that gets closed in this facility has no effect long-term on the hypothetical members of the public. So I know that was a lot of information, and please feel free to ask me any questions that you may have. That's all I have for you guys.
Folks, where are we going to start? Doug, let's start with you.
Doug Howard, CAB. Great presentation, Mr. White. Just a couple of questions. The NRC, how often do they come out to the site? Is it, how often in the year do they come out?
Well, they generally come out twice a year. One time they have their what's known as the on-site observational visits. They'll come out one time for the salt stone disposal units, and then they'll come out another time for the tank farms. But we have monthly phone calls in which we interact with them as well.
So they don't have a liaison on site at all times?
I do not believe that they do.
Thank you.
Okay. Dan?
Dan Kaminsky, CAB. Going to slide 7, you make a reference on the milestone of tanks 17 and 20. Could you shed some light on what that's trying to say there? I didn't quite get it.
Okay. So
17 and 20 are closed, correct?
Yes. Again, there was an original dispute. There was one of the first dispute resolution agreements was associated with an extension request, to close those particular tanks. So in that dispute resolution agreement, we set forth a new comprehensive planning schedule for closing the rest of the old style tanks. Okay. So basically, this is the part of the document in the FFA that aligns with that process.
So it's just an agreement as to differences of what you did on 17 and 20 versus the next ones?
Well,
Can I help you out?
yes.
Okay. So if you look at the tank chart that was in the last presentation for the status, you'll see for 17 and 20 that those tanks were closed in 1997. So the record of decision that was written was to cover the closure of those tanks at that time. And then as additional tanks are closed out, we basically do an explanation of significant difference to include the additional tanks as they are closed out. So it just basically is added to that record of decision.
Okay.
So that's what that means. It's a little confusing though.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Dave Isley.
Dave Isley, Cab. Thank you, Aaron, for that. I'm glad somebody understands regulatory because I could never get my head around it. You spoke of getting DHEC approval for lots of different activities. Who has the authority to make that approval, and yield to Susan if need be?
Well, there are different individuals for different approvals that are coming from the state, and I can't speak exactly to who would be those individuals.
So Aaron's right, there are several different approvals that come from us. It depends on which program area specifically we're looking at. So we have our Bureau of Water is involved with the industrial wastewater permit. Our federal facility agreement group, FFA group, does approvals as far as like our negotiations with the milestones, our negotiations over approving bulk waste removal efforts, and records of decision, and then our solid waste group has the Saltstone permit, so they would be the authority, the agreement on certain issues with that. Now, as far as our force majeure, all of those people are involved. We all look at those reports and have comments and questions that we ask, and are involved in, basically compiling all that into one approval or response to DOE.
Could some event take it to the governor's level? I mean, really to the top of the state level, or do y'all just try and handle it yourselves?
We try to keep it as low as we can. Our dispute resolution process is, it wouldn't go to the governor, but it would, so this is if there's a dispute with the FFA, it would follow a channel where we try to informally resolve it, and then if we can't informally, we elevate it to a formal dispute resolution. So there are different people, different levels within the organization that would be involved, and ultimately we could be the head of our agency, it could be the regional administrator at EPA and head at DOE. So it can get elevated. We try not to go there if we don't need to. I think for the most part we're very good about getting the right people in the room and getting the information we need to make good decisions and come to an agreement.
Yeah, and that's one thing I want to point out, the fact that we do have a really good working relationship with all of our regulators, actually. We do our best to make sure that we keep them informed throughout the process. That's one of the things that I've learned over my career. If you notice, this is my first time presenting to this cab. I just came here from Oak Ridge, but in my years of interacting with the Oak Ridge cab, the Tennessee regulators, as well as the EPA, communication is key. The more information that they have, the more they can understand the situation that we're in, and we're not blindsiding them with saying, hey, we're not producing anything, or hey, we're not going to be closing any tanks for the next 8 years, but we're telling you guys why, and we're showing you all the other things that we're doing in the meantime, and our goal is to be able to close a bunch of tanks, and in order to do that, we need SWPF in operation. And that's why that's the primary focus of the liquid waste program right now, getting ready to feed the salt waste processing facility.
AK Hassan Cab. On slide number 11, you have a description of the tanks and I guess how they're encased in concrete, etc.
Excuse me?
You have a description of the tanks and how they're encased in concrete or whatever. And we hear a lot about the leaks above the waste line, the waste material line, and some below where the heavy material is, etc. And I was just trying to ask you to give us a description of if tanks are leaking in that particular encasement, where is that material flowing through, if it's flowing?
Okay, I think I understand where you're going, and I think I have a better way to show you would be this image. And this is an example of one of our tanks, and you can see here, this is the entire volume available in the tank, right? But if there was a leak site identified, then we would not be able to we would not add any waste above that particular leak site. So you can see here, this where it says freeboard, of the roughly 1.1 million gallons available in the tank. Really, we only have maybe 100 or so gallons available, because there may or may not be leak sites above that for which we cannot add tanks, or we cannot add any liquid waste. And if I can go back to here, where a tank may leak, as I just showed in the other image, waste is kept below it, and it may leave the primary tank system and enter what's known as the analyst, which is this space in between the tanks. There's analyst there's a capturing system down here that can take the liquid or anything that would be captured in that analyst and pump it back into the primary to prevent it from accumulating. But again, and when we refer to leaks, they're more like weep sites or weeping, in which it's not even a drizzle, but just a slow accumulation of salt waste that's coming along the sides.
Eleanor Hobson Cab. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. White. The radioactive waste management manual, is this a manual that is available to the general public, or is it just for those who are affiliated with the SRS in particular?
It is a manual, well, it is a document that's available to the public. It's a very, very boring and slow read, but it's more of directives. It's part of our directive systems. Under the Atomic Energy Act, we have regulatory authority over all of our radioactive waste. The way we manage it is captured under our orders, DOE orders. Our order for radioactive waste management tells us to abide by this particular manual. That manual is the list of requirements and directives associated with managing radioactive waste. So you can look up DOE, Department of Energy directives systems, and then you can find that radioactive waste manual. If you're interested in that, the implementation guide is several thousand pages long and describes every process associated with that particular manual.
Is there anything published in layman's terms that would explain anything affiliated with that?
Not really.
I'm just concerned
I mean,
about the
I can.
information.
That's a hard one. If you honestly, if you look at the radioactive waste management order, right, that points to the guide, that's about as simple as it can get. There's a. I've been told over the years that we go from including all of our particular requirements either in the orders, and then it gets pulled out of the orders. So the order is very simple, so you can one can understand it. It's a simplified version of it, and all the requirements get put in a manual. And then there's a re-evolution to pull those requirements from the manuals back into the order, and that's in the stage where we are right now, in which the order is currently being revised to include all the requirements that were identified in the manual and put in the order. But if you look up, you could just Google the directive systems, DOE directive systems, and look at DOE Order 435.1, which is the radioactive waste management order. It is about as simple as it can get, which basically says these are the main things we want to do to clean up our radioactive waste, or not necessarily clean up, but to manage all of our radioactive waste.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Malcolm? Yeah, good presentation, by the way. Malcolm Phillips, CAB. I have a couple of base questions, and I just didn't understand it on slide 4. It says in the second bullet, as part of the agreement, DOE committed to remove from service those liquid radioactive waste tank systems that do not meet the standards set forth in X. I assume that is all 50 of those tanks, or is that only category 1 of those 50?
It is a small subset specifically associated with old style tanks and those with leak sites.
So then it was expanded to include those newer tanks later.
Well, the FFA, eventually all of the tanks will be closed under the FFA. But we were, as a part of the initial agreement, we were set to develop a comprehensive plan and schedule for closing specifically those old style tanks.
Okay, I understand it better now. Now on slide 6, you said that the agreement was suspended for all of it except for tank 10. What's up with tank 10?
Tank 10 is currently tank 10 is attached to the ticker unit, and there was not a need to suspend that milestone because we believe we can actually meet that milestone.
Okay, so you're meeting all the milestones on tank 10 today?
Yes.
Okay. Last question is...
Well, we believe so. I hate to speak for the state.
Okay, I'll take that as a yes. On the slide 11, you talked about the radioactive waste inspection program, which I love that construct. Is that an inspection program that includes not only the tanks but also the transfer lines, or is that simply a tank inspection program? Because transfer lines, as you well know, is a site of potential leak sources and sometimes major leak sources if you look historically at the issues.
That is correct. And honestly, I don't want to steer you incorrectly. I do believe we do have inspections associated with the piping system and transfer lines, but I do not believe that they are covered under this particular waste tank inspection program report.
Okay.
Yeah, I could follow up with you on that.
Because historically speaking, that's where some of the massive spills come from, and that's what the issue is here that we're talking about.
Understood.
All right. Anything further, folks?
One more.
Right on time.
One more.
Do you still have one, Eleanor? Do you still have a question? Your card. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, guys.
All right, so we're right on time for our 11 o'clock lunch. Few pro tips: larger groups lead to larger ticket times, so think smart when you're planning your meal. And if you're not haven't paid and are on your way back by noon, you're probably doing something wrong. Let's be back in here by 12:30 and we'll get started. Thank you, everybody. 12:30.